All right, let's dive into this. Finding the best chainsaw for an Alaskan mill, you know, for turning those logs into usable slabs.
Oh,
I've been
yeah.
going through a bunch of YouTube reviews, forum discussions,
Mhm.
articles about chainsaws, Andy milling. Lots of good stuff out there.
Yeah, it's a popular topic.
It is. So I'm ready to break it all down.
Awesome. It's definitely a question that you have to think about carefully. It's not just about getting the most powerful saw you can find.
Right. That's what I was thinking too. Like I was reading about this guy, Michael Newby, who uses a Stihl 660 for 30-inch slabs.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty impressive. But even he was saying that for serious production milling, he wishes he had like an 880 or an 09 ZOG.
Oh, wow.
So it makes you wonder, why is that extra power so important?
Well, with the larger milling projects, the bigger saw and the bigger engine can handle those cuts without bogging down or overheating.
Oh, I see.
It's like the difference between moving a mountain with a shovel versus a bulldozer.
That's a great analogy.
Mm.
So are we saying that it's better to have two chainsaws? One for milling and then a smaller one for like felling and limbing and stuff?
Yeah, a lot of experienced millers will actually recommend that because using a heavy saw for everything can be tiring and dangerous in some situations.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's all about picking the right tool for the job.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into some specifics. For milling, I saw the Stihl MS661CM, the 462CM, and the 391. Also the Husqvarna 576XP.
Yeah,
Are those all in that like 70cc range?
exactly. All around 70 cc, which is a good starting point for milling. And they have those features like anti-vibration, which is important for long milling sessions.
Yeah, for sure. You don't want to be all shaky after a few cuts.
Yeah.
So what about for the smaller saws? What did you see in your research?
The Still 360, 361, and 362. Those
Okay.
are all pretty popular. The Echo CS400 is also a good option.
Yeah, I've heard good things about those.
Reliable, good value. And if you want something really light, the Still MS251CBE.
Okay, so it's like having a Swiss Army knife of chainsaws. We've got a saw for everything.
Yeah.
But what about the Alaskan mill itself?
Right, yeah. Choosing the right mill is important for sure. We see a lot about the Granberg Alaskan mill and the Logosol M8.
Yeah, those are the two big names I saw too. It seems like the Granberg is more budget-friendly, and Logosol is easier to use but costs more.
Yeah, that's the trade-off. The Granberg needs a bit more muscle to use. The Logosol is a bit more like an automatic.
Oh, okay. So it's all about finding that balance between cost, ease of use, and your budget.
Yeah.
But before we go any further, let's talk about that first cut.
Yeah, that first cut, you need to set up a straight, level reference surface before you start cutting.
So it's like building a house. You got to start with a good foundation.
Exactly. That initial reference surface will make sure all of your cuts are accurate and consistent.
Okay, so before we get too far, I want to rewind a bit. We were
Ugh.
talking about chainsaws and mentioned ripping chain. What is that, and why is it so important?
Ripping chain is designed specifically for milling. It has a different tooth geometry, a more aggressive hook angle, and a deeper gullet. This allows it to remove those wood chips much more efficiently.
Ah, okay. So
Yeah.
you're saying it's not just about the chainsaw power. The chain also plays a big role in cutting speed and smoothness.
Yeah, it makes a big difference for sure. And speaking of optimizing things, we have to talk about maintenance.
Oh, yeah, for sure. You could have the best saw and mill in the world, but if they aren't properly maintained, you're in trouble. What were the key maintenance points?
Keeping that chain sharp. A dull chain not only slows you down, but can also lead to kickback.
Oh, wow. Kickback. That sounds scary. What is that?
Kickback is when the tip of the bar hits something or gets pinched, and it causes the saw to rotate back towards you really fast. It can cause some serious injury.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's why keeping the chain sharp is so important.
Yeah, it helps prevent the saw from getting bound up. And it's not just about sharpness. Proper chain tension and lubrication are important as well. Think about it like taking care of your car. Regular maintenance helps keep it running smoothly.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we've covered choosing the right saw and mill, the importance of that first cut, and the magic of ripping chain and maintaining your tools. Where do we go from here?
Let's talk about the milling process itself.
So we've got our saw and mill. We're all geared up and ready to go. But before we make that first cut, what else should we be thinking about?
Yeah, the setup process is super important for safety and for the quality of the lumber you get.
Right. So like you said before, you need a good foundation.
Exactly.
But those logs are huge. How do you even keep them from moving around while you're cutting?
You can use wedges or supports to keep the log from rolling or shifting during the milling, especially if it's a big log or if you're working on uneven ground.
Okay, so once we have that log locked in place, how do we actually plan out where to make the cuts?
That's where it gets strategic. What are you trying to make? Long, straight planks, thick beams, live edge slabs. How you position that log is going to determine what kind of cuts you can make and how much usable lumber you will get.
Oh, okay. So it's like lumber Tetris. You want to maximize how much you can get out of each log.
Yeah, exactly. This is where understanding those milling techniques becomes super important.
Okay, so we talked about ripping chain, but what other techniques do we need to know?
Well, the depth of cut is a big one. That's going to determine the thickness of your slabs. But you can't just set the mill to whatever thickness you want. You have to consider the power of the saw, the width of the log, and even the type of wood.
Okay, so what happens if you make too deep of a cut?
If you push the saw too hard or cut too deep, you can end up binding the saw.
Binding. What's that?
Binding is when the saw gets stuck in the cut, which can cause a lot of strain on the saw and even lead to kickback.
Ah, okay. So we really want to avoid that.
Definitely. And then there is feed rate,
Mm.
which is how fast you push the saw through the log. Too slow and you're wasting time and maybe overheating the saw. Too fast and you risk uneven cuts, kickback, or even stalling the engine.
Ah, I see. So it's about finding that sweet spot. Not too fast and not too slow.
Exactly. And this is where practice makes perfect. Learning how to read the wood, feeling the resistance, and adjusting your feed rate as you go.
Yeah, you mentioned feeling the resistance, and the sources talk a lot about how important it is to keep your chain sharp. It sounds like sharpening isn't a one-time thing. You have to do it pretty regularly.
Yeah, for sure. A sharp chain cuts so smoothly and efficiently, and it makes it much less likely that you'll get kickback.
Okay, so how do we actually keep the chain sharp?
You can use a file or a hand crank sharpener. The important thing is that you maintain the correct sharpening angles.
Okay, it sounds like there is a real art to milling lumber with a chainsaw. It's not just about having a powerful saw.
Yeah, it's a skill you have to learn.
Okay, so we've covered the setup, milling techniques, and maintenance. Anything else we should know?
Always think about safety.
Yes. Safety first. What are some of the things we need to be careful about?
Always wear the right safety gear. A helmet, chaps, gloves, and eye and ear protection.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier, but what else?
Make sure you have a clear work area, good lighting, and make sure someone knows where you are working.
Okay, yeah, that's good advice.
And remember that those logs are really heavy. Be careful when lifting and ask for help if you need it.
Great reminders. So we've talked about a lot. Choosing the right gear, the milling techniques, safety. Let's finish things up by answering some commonly asked questions.
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's get to those commonly asked questions. One that I saw a lot was about setting up that reference surface for the first cut with an Alaskan mill.
Oh, yeah.
It sounds like that's really important to get right.
Yeah, if you don't have a straight level reference, your cuts are going to be off and you'll end up with a bunch of unusable lumber.
Right.
The sources recommend using a 2x8, or you can even use a guide rail. And you clamp those to the log so that you have that initial guide for your mill.
So you're saying like a 2x8 running the length of the log. But what if you have a really long log?
Yeah, if you have a really long log, you'll probably want to use a guide rail. Those are usually aluminum or steel, and they are designed to span those longer distances. It's kind of like using a ruler versus a yardstick.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
That makes sense. So another question that came up a lot was about the types of wood that you can mill. Can you mill any type of wood?
You can technically mill almost any wood,
Okay.
but some are definitely easier to work with than others. Softwoods like pine and cedar are more forgiving.
Okay.
They tend to cut more smoothly, and you don't need as much power to cut them.
But you can still mill hardwoods, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I can imagine those would make some really beautiful slabs.
Oh, yeah. Hardwoods like oak and maple are beautiful and strong,
Yeah.
but they are more challenging to mill. You need more power to cut through them, and the grain can be a bit more unpredictable. And they might have knots, which are tough on the saw chain.
Okay, so maybe start with softwoods to get the hang of it.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea.
And no matter what type of wood you're using, maybe start with smaller logs until you've got some experience.
Definitely.
Okay, so last question. Is milling lumber with a chainsaw safe?
Well, it can be safe, but you have to be really careful and take all the necessary precautions. We've talked about the safety gear, the helmet, chaps, eye and ear protection, and gloves.
Right.
But it's also about being aware of your surroundings.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure your work area is clear, you have good lighting, and someone knows where you are.
Right. Good advice.
And don't operate a chainsaw if you're tired or have been drinking.
Or if you're unsure about something, ask for help.
Yeah.
Better safe than sorry. Right.
Exactly. And remember, there are a lot of great resources out there. Don't be afraid to ask for help from people who are more experienced.
Yeah, for sure. So now that we're at the end of our deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
Milling lumber with a chainsaw is a journey. You're going to learn as you go. But if you invest in the right tools, focus on safety, and keep learning, you'll be able to turn those raw logs into some beautiful lumber, and it's really satisfying.
Absolutely. And to leave everyone with one last thought, we've been talking about chainsaws and Alaskan mills, which are great. But what about hand tools? What role could those play in your process? So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep creating.